Yeah, that was a really inspiring introduction, and now I kind of feel very hard to live up to that. Look, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about kind of data breaches in Australia and what we observed with a key outcome measure in our survey, which is trust in institutions with regards to data privacy. Now, unfortunately, it's a little bit like this is us. Is that the show? Anyway, so we're only on the penultimate episode at the moment. So we've got another wave of data collection coming out in April. And we're still really trying to understand what we found in the data and what it kind of means. And there's also a really kind of interesting finding, which was a bit different to our prior expectations, and trying to understand and work through kind of what that might mean. And so part of this presentation is kind of working through some of that uncertainty. So just to set the scene, in September of last year, there was a very large data breach in Australia for one of our large telecommunication companies, about 10 million Australian residents. So that's about 40% of the population. Their data was released, and then following in November, there was another data breach, slightly fewer people, but a more sensitive data from a health insurance company. And from that data breach, there was information on people's health transactions, as well as their health outcomes. A lot of media attention and a lot of focus on an issue which doesn't really get a lot of attention. But why do we care about kind of trust? So just to set the scene again, why do we care about kind of trust with regards to institutions with data? Well, here's might be a little bit hard to see, but here's one data point from our survey as well, which kind of highlights why we should care about this as an outcome. So early on in the pandemic, like in other countries, in Australia, we had our check-in codes, QR codes for kind of contact tracing. And in our survey, we found that those who had a higher level of trust in institutions controlling for a range of other characteristics were more likely to use a kind of check-in codes for when they're utilizing when they're at restaurants, those types of things. So it's a predictive, our outcome which we're using is highly predictive. It's important for a range of things. It's important for the government. The government has introduced new legislation around sharing of data, and they're really keen on monitoring this as an outcome. So we have this outcome, kind of trust in institutions, and then we had these two large data breaches. And we're also relatively, well, quite fortunate in that around this time, we had a few surveys going into the field where we're able to ask kind of longitudinally, but also if we need kind of repeated cross sections, where we can see how people's views on trust in institutions changed over a relatively short period of time. So we're using the Life in Australia panel, which was introduced yesterday, I think, by Darren Penney, and there'll be a few other kind of presentations this afternoon on the panel. So in August of 2022, just prior to the data breaches, I wouldn't say we're in any way prophetic, but we happened to be asking our module on data trust, which we've asked a couple of times. So we're in the field in August, just looking through the data and thinking about our October survey. And Anna's here, who's from the data collection company. We just finalized our survey for October, and then a very apologetic email to Anna, I think the week before the next survey was going to go into the field, maybe on the Friday, saying, do you mind if we add an extra question, which I'm sure survey administrators love. So we then asked in our October survey a couple of data privacy questions. So we repeated. So this is just, we had data pre and then post the first data breach. So October, we asked the questions again. Once again, don't blame us. There was another data breach in November. And this time we had a little bit more time for our January survey to plan our data collection. So essentially we have pre-COVID data, some COVID, a few waves during COVID, and then data from August, October, and January. With data breaches, large data breaches, which really did capture the national attention in September and November of last year. So what happened? What was the impact on this really important outcome measure, which we care about as researchers, which policymakers care about, and I think is, and as I'll go on and show in a little bit, also quite relevant for data collectors in terms of people's kind of panel behavior. So in October, with lots of apologizing and begging, no, there was no begging, just apologizing. In addition to our repeat measures, we also asked a question about, have you been exposed to a data breach? So this is knowingly exposed. So as I said, about 40% of the population were exposed in just a single data breach. About 30, around about a third or so of the population said that they were aware of a data breach in the previous 12 months. So obviously some slight I don't think it's underreporting. I think it's just not knowing whether you were exposed, and also some kind of variation across the population. Not much difference by gender, but quite large kind of age differences, and non-linear as well. So essentially those aged between about 25 and 44 had the largest exposure to data breaches, mostly because that's the age group with probably the most kind of interaction with kind of settings where you're likely to be exposed. Okay, so what do we find? Well, let's look at our outcome leading up to the data breaches, which is essentially trust in 8 institutions or sets of types of institutions with regards to data privacy. So at the top is the federal government, the Commonwealth government. Then we have state and territory governments, so federal system like in the US, banks, social media, quite low, not surprising, universities and academic institutions, relatively high, yay for us. Telecommunications companies, that's fortunately we had time series on that. Online companies, and then the equivalent of our combined Census Bureau and Bureau of Labour Statistics and a whole bunch of other things. So the official stats agencies, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So this is kind of the pre-data breach data, useful to get a sense of parallel trends, but also just to get a sense of what happened during COVID. And essentially, so the first bar is pre-COVID, October 2018. That's the last time we did the survey prior to COVID. Then we did it in May, early on, August 2021, August 2022. We're not going to do it again until August 2023, but obviously things changed. And you can see a big increase in trust in institutions with regards to data during the COVID period. The banks is a bit of an outlier, and the reason for that is during the October survey, there was a Royal Commission into banks where it was shown they had quite poor behaviour. So that was a low baseline, but otherwise relatively similar trends. So big increase early on in COVID, and then slight declines back to, but nowhere near baseline. So data trust had improved just prior, or not just prior, but leading up to the data breach. So then what happened afterwards? So this slide here takes the story a little bit further. So our top bar here is the last bar in the previous slides. So that's the August 2022 level of trust. And so what we found is, not surprisingly, if you go to the third from bottom, there was quite a large decline in trust in telecommunication companies with regards to data privacy. That's not a huge surprise. That was the industry which had the large data breach. So in absolute terms, quite a large decline, and also in relative terms. Not much change in four of the other, or five of the other institutions, but there was big declines in two other institutions which were puzzling. So the first was universities and other academic institutions, which in both absolute and relative, or mostly absolute, but also to a lesser extent in relative terms, had a very large decline in trust over that very short window. So August to October, only 2 months, should be a relatively stable trade, declined quite a fair bit. And also the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, there was no data breaches over this period which had anything to do with universities. There was no data breaches which had anything to do with the Federal Stats Agency. So it was a curious kind of finding. But what explains it is that leading up to, I think it was pre-COVID, but at least a couple of years beforehand, there had been data breaches with universities, and including my own, and also for the 2016 census, we have a 5-yearly census. There was not a data breach, but essentially the servers for the collection, data collection for the census had crashed. So people weren't able to do their census online. So essentially what this shows here is that for some institutions, which had nothing to do with the specific data breach, there's an issue salience. So the data breach which occurred outside of those institutions reminded people of a kind of previous incidents for those institutions. So it's kind of a negative externality. But what's even more interesting, at least to me, is that between October and January, the telecommunications companies, their trust essentially went back to baseline. So there's no significant difference between trust in telecommunications companies by January compared to August, despite having the largest data breach in Australia's history, and also not quite having dealt with kind of customers over that period. Whereas for universities, the figures hadn't returned to baseline, and essentially it stayed lower than they were kind of pre-data breach. So that's the puzzle. That's the bit which I can't quite explain. We've looked at confidence in just general confidence in universities, no real change. So it's specifically with regards to data privacy. Sorry, there's also some other slides here about kind of views on kind of government in government action with regards to data breaches, which I'll skip through and just get to the summary. And also just the final bit, which is about kind of the data collection side of things. So just to summarize, strong relationship between changes in trust and exposure to a data breach. That's at the aggregate, but also at the individual level as well. So those who reported that they had been exposed to a data breach, their trust declined by more than the general population, at about 10% of a tenth of a standard deviation. We also found, and this is kind of the thing which I'll kind of finish on, we also found that there was a decline for those who completed the October 2022 survey. So this is those who, after that data breach, had at least completed another survey were still less likely to have completed the January 2023 survey. So this is kind of a weak test because we didn't have the data breach question prior to the October survey to see whether a kind of a pre-exposure measure, but still, if you've done one survey after a data breach, you are still less likely to do a follow-up survey in only 2 months later. So it not only impacts on this kind of broad outcome, but it also impacts on kind of your survey participation. So that's the final, I think I'm out of time. Yep. So as the final point, I have no idea about what explains kind of the findings with universities. So maybe we can bring it up in the discussion. Thanks.